Hi everybody, I'm Melissa here with Burnley and Trowbridge, and today we're going to do a hat mini sew-along so that you can learn how to decorate a hat for fashion as well as to protect you from the sun. And we're going to learn how to do these 3 styles of hats. But before we jump in and start decorating our hats, we're going to hear from Angela, and she's going to give us a little bit of the history of this type of a hat in the 18th century.
Hi, everyone. I know you're excited about getting started on your hats, but I thought I'd tell you a little bit about them before you get started. So today we're using straw, which we have documented to the 18th century. You see it in portraiture. There are ones in collections, including Colonial Williamsburg, who owns several that are identified as straw. They are left plain, or they are completely or partially covered. Um, they sometimes have minimal amounts of trim, just a little bit of ribbon possibly, or they can have loads of trims on them. The time frame that we're going for, and I believe Melissa will be talking about, is from 1760 to about 1785. If you look at paintings, such as paintings of women sitting, or even genre paintings, you find these hats. They range in, say, 12 to 16 inches in diameter, and the crown has started to drop when you get post 1750s. So you've got a low crown and then this saucer. As hairstyles become higher, the hat goes from being on top of the head and moving forward. But the size of the hat and the aesthetics of the hat can remain the same. Decorations, as I'd said before, can be very minimal or they can be quite elaborate. You see paintings where you have very simple ribbons being worn by women of high socioeconomic status as well as lower socioeconomic status. Most typically, what you see on the hats, as far as trims go, are ribbons, sometimes gauze, and perhaps when you get later into the 80s, flowers. The ribbons, I know you asked, they're silk, right? Well, if I'm a poor person, can I afford that? Absolutely. We've been able to corroborate that information by looking at a lot of ribbons that were kept in the Foundling collection in London. These would have been given up as tokens for children that were being left there, and these were people that did not have money, but yet they had silk ribbon. So have at it with the silk ribbon, and I hope you have fun.
Thanks for that information, Angela. So now we're going to look at the supplies that we will need for this sew-along. First, you will need a straw hat. We have them in both natural and black. It was not unusual for straw hats to be dyed, so the black is very appropriate as well. And then you need something to use to decorate your hat. We have ribbons in 1/2 inch, 1 1/4 inch, and 2 inch in our taffetas. We also have a 1/2 inch and 1 inch in Padua soy, and 1/2 inch and 1 inch in our single-face silk satins. You can also use some of our taffeta fabric and then rip it or cut it into strips and either form tubes or hem it, or you could even pink the edges and use it that way as if it were a ribbon. You will also need thread because you can't sew without thread. You also need needles. We do suggest using the milliner's needles because they are fine and flexible. And we also suggest something along the lines of a sharp that's a little bit sturdier. You can find all of this information in the sew-along supplies list. And then you will probably want a thimble. That's how I actually learned to use a thimble, was making hats. And some scissors. And then you'll want either pins or some clips, which you can get online and Google, and you can find some super cute ones on Etsy, or you can also buy them from any quilting or sewing shop. You may also want to have a pair of pliers or a needle puller handy, because sometimes it's a little challenging to try to get the needle through the straw. So gather all your supplies together and we'll get started. For our first hat today, we're going to do a very simple trim around the crown of our black straw hat with some 1/2-inch red taffeta ribbon. So we will take our ribbon and just wrap it around the crown of the hat to figure out how much we need. I like to overlap it just a little bit, since we're going to also put a bow on this, because you always need another bow. I'm not going to worry about finishing the end of this particular one. Gotten an idea of how big that needs to be by just overlapping it. I'm going to take my scissors and trim that down to size. If you want to be able to change the ribbons out on your hat a lot, you can just tack the ribbon together where it overlaps and slide it over the crown of your hat and just leave it that way. I personally, because I'm really good at losing things, like to actually tack the ribbon to the hat in 2 or 3 spots. And you can either knot your thread, or you can take a couple of back stitches in the silk. I personally like to put a fairly substantial knot, because a small knot can actually pull through the straw of your hat and let loose. So we don't want that to happen. So we'll just tack this end down, or the 2 ends actually together. And then I usually fasten it off on the inside of the hat. And there are frequently little bits of straw sticking out, so you may end up catching your thread on them, and that's always fun. So just kind of take it slow and pay attention to what you're doing. Or you can just make a big ugly knot like that one. And then clip your thread, and then kind of check the security of the ribbon on your hat. If you like the way it's sitting and you think it's not going to go anywhere, you can leave it just like that. If you think that it's going to fall off, then you can go ahead and tack it in 1 or 2 more spots around the crown, and it will be nice and secure. Next, we're going to take some more ribbon, and we're going to tie a simple bow. Bows in the 18th century were very popular. You see them all the time on all classes of people. So for a simple tied bow, we can just take a length of ribbon. I like to work from whatever I've purchased and cut it off as I go, rather than measuring things out. That way you don't have as much waste. So we take the ribbon, make a loop, and bring it around just like tying your tennis shoes. And then you can decide how long you want the little legs on your bow to be. This is just a sweet, tiny little bow. And I usually like to cut the ends of my bows at an angle. That helps to keep the ribbon from fraying while it's being worn and whipping around in the wind. And then you want to snug it up good so that it doesn't want to come undone easily. And then going to take our thread again and attach our cute little bow right over the join. So that will cover our little join there. Try not to stab yourself because that hurts. And we'll just take a couple stitches. You could also do this by just having a length of ribbon and tying it directly around the crown and not even bothering with tacking it down. That way, if you're at an event and want to change your ribbon out to match your outfit for each day, if you have different outfits, you can do it really quickly and easily. So we'll just anchor this off. And cut our threads. And now we have our cute little bow on our hat. But as you may know, these types of hats do not sit on your head so that they stay. So we're going to add some ribbon to be able to tie our hat onto our head. There are multiple ways that you can attach the ties for your hat. So I'm going to show you a little bit different way on each of our hats. For the first one, we are going to make sure we know where the bow is because the person who is going to be wearing this hat wants the bow at the side. So what we will do, since we stitched our bow down and have this nice little knot of thread here, we can tell exactly where that first tie needs to go. You can measure out ties if you want to. I usually make them about 24 inches, or I just measure using body parts. In the 18th century, it's a pre-industrial society, so we don't have to do anything a particular way. Using body parts to measure is really easy, and that way you don't have to worry about having a tape measure or ruler with you. And then I hold the end of my tie under twice to give a good amount of fabric for my thread to hang on to. It's easiest for me personally to then pin it to the hat right at the juncture of the crown and the brim. So right where that semi-right angle is. And then I pin it on. I personally like to match my thread to my ribbon when I'm sewing things to a hat, unless I'm going to be going clear through the hat, and then I may decide to use a thread color which is closer to the color of the straw rather than the color of the ribbon, if I want the stitches to be kind of invisible on the right side of the hat. Don't be afraid to kind of curl your straw to be able to help you hang on to what you're doing. It will flatten back out. I usually try to do kind of a cross stitch when I attach a ribbon tie to a hat. It seems to be a little more secure, especially with the finer silk ribbons. So I go across one way and then come back the opposite way to sort of make some X's. And then anchor my thread. Trim it off. And do the same thing, exactly opposite on the inside of the crown. If you do want to sew clear through the straw, that is perfectly acceptable as well. We don't really have a lot of information on exactly how these things were done in the 18th century. It's like most things, a lot of speculation. But this seems to be a pretty good method for doing it. And there we have a very sweet little hat to make you fashionable and to keep the sun off of your face. Ta-da! For our next hat, we're going to be using this illustration as our inspiration for the decoration for the crown as well as for the brim. As you can see, she has a lot of little poofs and then a bow kind of off to the side front and then some binding around the edge of the brim. So I have chosen 2 sizes of ribbon to do this particular hat. The narrower taffeta ribbon, which is a 1/2 inch, is going to be used to bind the brim of the hat, and the 1¼ inch ribbon will be used as the poofs on the crown. So to start with our crown decoration, we can divide up the top of the crown into however many sections we want to use for our decoration. I don't want to do quite as many poofs as are in the image that I'm loosely basing this on. So I am going to divide it into 8 sections. One way that I like to do this is I do it by eye. A lot of things in the 18th century are done that way, by eye or by using body parts or a string or something to measure what you are doing. So what I am doing is I set pins directly across from each other at basically 12 and 6. And then I placed pins at 3 and 9. And then I am also going in and dividing those sections in half so that I will end up with 8 fairly evenly spaced poofs. And if I decide that something's a little off, like these, not too bad. If you want to be really precise about it, what you can do is take a piece of paper and square it up. Just like that. And then fold it in half again. And then once more. And then you can take a push pin of some sort, and right at that point, you can use a piece of string. If you have a compass, that works really well. and then use a pencil take your pencil and draw an arc. My pencil doesn't want to cooperate today, which is pretty close to a nice portion of a circle. Cut that. When you open it out, you have your 8 sections, which you can lay onto your crown, and it will show you where to mark them. If you decide you want to do more sections, you can put a pin at the halfway point between each of those, and it makes it super easy to section out your crown. Again, you don't have to be super precise about it. I usually am not. It's just quicker and easier to do it by eye, and it's very 18th century to do it that way. So next, I need to decide how big I want my puffs to be. I'll take the end of my ribbon and lay it against one of the pins, and then I can kind of squish where the next one would be, because these will be gathered, and decide how big I want my puffs. I don't want anything too over the top for this, so I think that looks pretty good. That's too tight. I like that. So then what I like to do is figure out about how many finger widths or how many finger lengths, because you always have your body parts with you. So I want the length of the ribbon between each of my pins to be about the length of my index finger. I can also just do each one by eye, but this way it becomes a little more uniform. I am going to turn under the very end of my ribbon, just because it makes it a little bit sturdier than trying to gather along that raw edge. And I'll just do, it doesn't have to be pretty, it doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be even, just something to gather down your ribbon end. I personally like to pull the gathering stitches down, then bring my thread around and back through the gathers to anchor it good. And then, so I don't have to cut and restart thread all the time, I like to anchor that thread to my first point at the crown. You can pull it clear through the hat, or you can, if you're good, if you're talented, you can just catch some of the straw and anchor it that way. And things may fight you, because sewing through straw is not always the easiest thing to do. It does like to grab your thread and make a knot. Also be very careful, because you have pins sticking in where your hand is. It's kind of like petting the cat on the belly when you know you shouldn't. So since I've attached this first spot, then I'm going to go ahead and anchor this on the inside of the hat so that I don't have floats or long threads that might get caught in things running along the inside of my hat. So I'm going to measure out the length of my index finger. So at that point, I will attach my thread here. gather it up snug. If you want your poofs to have a little more volume, if you don't really want them snug at the anchor points, you can leave a little more leeway in your gathering stitches. I personally like to pull them up fairly tight. Get that another little anchor right there and bring it through. Bring it through for the next pin. You do that all the way around until you get all of your pins out of your hat and all of your ribbon anchored at those points. So now we've gotten to our last little puff, and what we want to do, since we're working from the bulk of our ribbon, is to measure out how big we want our puff to be. And then I like to add just a little bit, so again I can turn that edge of the ribbon down underneath and run my gathering stitches through 2 layers so that I don't pull the gathering stitches out of the end of the ribbon. And then once we get this one gathered down, we can anchor it right next to where we started doing all of our little poofs. And finish off that thread. And now we have a nice little set of poofs going around the crown of our hat. You can leave it just like this if you like, but if there is an opportunity to put a bow on it, you should put a bow on it. So if you have kind of an ugly spot where you started and ended the ribbon when you were doing your poofs around the crown, you can just make a little bow and cover that up, or you can make a big bow and cover that up. For this particular hat, I wanted to do a bow that has 4 loops and some little legs sticking out. You can cut each portion separately, or you can do it all at once. So again, perfection is not necessary. If your legs aren't all the same length, that's okay too. So I will usually kind of fuss with it until it's about where I think I want it. It's good to have already threaded your needle and tied your knot before you start running your gathering stitch on your bows. Otherwise you have to lay them down and then you might not like it as much when you pick it back up. So again, we just run a gathering stitch through all of those layers. And then I like to run it back down again just to secure them. And it's amazing how unwieldy silk can be and thick and hard to get through when you put that many layers together. That's why we use thimbles. And then just because it's a lot to mess with, I like to trim the bow off from the rest of the ribbon. So then I grab my hat, find where I joined the ribbons again, and anchor the bow to the hat. Sometimes the taffeta ribbon is a little flimsy and may not give you the look that you really want. So you can starch it like I did with this piece. You'll want to use a liquid starch or a powdered starch that you turn into a liquid. You don't want it super heavy, but just enough to give it some body, but still give it a little bit of movement and life. You really don't want to use a spray starch because it will spot your silk and then it just looks really messy. So I have pre-starched this piece of ribbon, and if you noticed in the image that I showed you at the beginning of this segment, the bow on the young lady's hat is off to one side from center front, and the tails actually stick up in the air. So that's how I'm going to do this bow. Now, if you are going to an event or a weekend somewhere and you only have one hat to take, but you know you want more than one look, you can do a flat crown band like we did on the first hat and just attach all of your poofs to that band, and then you can tack it on, or if it's snug enough, just have it set on your crown, and then you can take it off and put a different one on for a different look if you want to match your outfit. So I'm going to take my ribbon like I did with the previous bow, lay it over itself into that little decorative bow shape, bring it back around again for a second set of loops. And I am spacing my loops a little bit further apart than I did on the first bow so that my ends will stick up very nicely. So since I have that in a shape that I like and a size, yeah. So I like the way that looks now. So I will run my gathering stitches through the center of all of those pieces. And this is fiddly and will aggravate you to no end until you get used to doing it. If you need to, it is perfectly fine to pin it, to hold it together until you can get it stitched. That is also another way that you can add trims to your hat. You can pin them on. It's a good idea to bury the tips of the pins into the straw so that you don't accidentally reach up and rake your hand across a pin and bleed all over your new outfit or your new hat. So we'll anchor this off a little bit. Come on. And I will stitch it to my hat right where my join between the two ends of my crown decoration are. And as you are stitching your bow to your hat, you can kind of manipulate the loops and the legs and tack them exactly where you want them if they're not behaving after you just stitched it together. Just nail them down and make them behave. This is one of those places where I find it useful to use a needle grabber. These are available at pretty much any basic sewing store, or a small pair of pliers, because sometimes stitching through all those layers, I have a problem grabbing the needle to get it clear through. That's why it's also a good idea to use a longish needle when you're doing this particular part. And then I'll anchor my threads. And since I want those tails to be sticking up, I am going to trim them down to about the same size. And then you can shorten up the legs of your bow until they're the length that you want. And now we have our perky-legged little bow on top of the ribbon that's going around the crown of our hat. Our inspiration hat also has the narrow ribbon around the brim, the outside edge of your hat. So to do that, you can fold it in half. You can press it with an iron if you want to, or you can just kind of finger press it. If you're adventurous, you can just stitch as you go. I'm not quite that adventurous today, so I will actually attach the ribbon to the hat before I stitch it down. With a ribbon this narrow, it should curve around the brim of the hat without a problem. If you're using a little bit wider ribbon, you can run a gathering stitch on the edges of your ribbon and ease it around the hat, or you can cheat and you can take an iron and press it into a curve so that it wraps around the brim of your hat nicely. So once you get your ribbon folded in half, I like to start with the seam at the back, at what I'm going to use as the back of my hat. With this one, as in with the image that I showed you earlier, I want the bow to the left of center towards the front. So this area back here is what will be the back of my hat. So I put the fold against the outside edge of the brim. You can pin it, but that gets really dangerous. So if I'm not doing this in an historic setting, then I use my little clips. If you're a quilter, you're probably familiar with these. They're also great if you're sewing on silk and are worried about putting pinholes in it, or if you're sewing on a vinyl or leather or something. So we'll just work our way around, clipping every so often. So that the binding lies smoothly. And then we clip, clip, clip all the way around. As you come to the end, or back to the beginning actually, of your brim edge, you'll want to leave about an inch or so, just to be on the safe side, before you clip off that extra bit of ribbon. We'll deal with that part later once we finish sewing the rest of the binding to the hat. We aren't entirely certain of how this was done in the period. They might have sewn through the straw each way and done the entire stitching process in one pass. I find that it's actually easier to whip stitch to one side of the brim and then flip it over and whip stitch it down on the other side. So that's how we're going to do this. So I like to start just a little bit away from where the ends of my ribbon will be put together. These don't have to be super neat stitches. You do want to try to make sure that the stitches that are under the ribbon are actually under the ribbon or through the straw, so that they're not just hanging out on the edge of the hat. This is also one of those places where you may decide that you want either a curved needle or a pair of pliers or a needle puller, just to help you get hold of that needle and pull it on through while you're working, because it doesn't always want to go. So once you've gotten your binding sewn around the outside edge of your hat, the outside of the brim, we're going to you want to leave a little tail unstitched so that we can finish it off and it will look nice and tidy. I like to leave about a ½ inch or so beyond where the under piece of the binding sits and trim that off. And then I'll fold that end under. Sure, I will. And give it a little bit of a finger press. With a heavier ribbon, you may want to just cut off those little points at the ends of your ribbon that are folded under at an angle. Cut a little triangle off so that they are not sticking out when you stitch it down, and it just looks really nice and neat, and it doesn't add extra bulk. With the taffeta ribbon, it's really not necessary, and if you find that it is kind of sticking out, you can tuck it back in and it will be just fine. I've stitched all the way around except for the last couple of inches. I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but it is good to use a flexible needle for this particular portion and have several extras, because I can tell you from experience of sewing this hat, you may destroy a needle or two. I bent one really nicely. So we're going to come up here a little bit further. You want to have that folded edge so that it covers up the raw edge of the piece that's underneath. And then you can just You can whip it, or you can do a little ladder type of stitch so that you really can't see very much of it. You just want to try to make sure that your edges are even. And we'll do the rest of the top side. Just like this. And we'll take one last stitch here and anchor our thread. So now we have our hat all decorated around the crown as well as around the brim. So the last thing to do on this one is to put on some ties to help keep it on our heads. Like I said earlier, I want my little bow to be at about, what would that be, about 10 o'clock. So to get my ties where I want them on the hat, I want to attach them at about the 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock points. And because I have attached my crown decoration at those 2 points, when I flip the hat over, I know where I'm going to be attaching my ribbons. To make sure that I don't move the hat around and hit the wrong spots, I'm going to put a pin at each one as a reminder. I'll take the rest of, or some of the rest of my wider ribbon that I used to trim the crown of the hat. Measure off. I like to use about an arm's length for my ribbons for my hats. You may want to use a little bit more or a little bit less depending on the size of your head, the size of your hair, and how big a bow you want when you have tied the hat onto your head. So I'm going to cut that. So now I've got some extra ribbon I can use for something else later. And since this is double the length I need, I like to do an angle cut or a bias type cut for the ends of my hat ribbons. That way they don't fray as quickly and it's a nice look. So I cut it in the middle at an angle so I'm not wasting extra ribbon, and I just get 2 nice angled cuts. Then I take the straight end and I fold it under a couple of times just to give a nice sturdy area to stitch to the hat, and finger press that down. Then I will, with our first hat, if you remember, we attached them right at the join where the crown meets the brim of the hat. On this hat, I want to do it a little bit differently, so I'm going to bring it out about a finger width from the crown brim ridge there. You see this done on period hats. Like I've said before, there's a lot of variation. There's no standardization. There's no really right or wrong way to do this. For this particular step, I will frequently stitch clear through the hat just to make sure it's really secure, because Virginia can get windy. And so I use a thread that will kind of blend into the hat. As you can see, when I lay this thread on the hat, it pretty much disappears. It will show on the ribbon, but I'm not as concerned with that as I am with not having big green threads across the top of my hat. And again, you can sew this in a cross stitch pattern with the X's, which is my preferred method and is something that I have seen on extant hats. Or you can sew 2 rows of straight stitching. It's kind of just up to you. I also find that it usually goes a little more quickly if you do the cross stitches. And again, if you are one who wants to trade out ribbons and decoration on just one hat at an event or something, the fewer stitches you take when you attach something, the fewer stitches you have to rip out when you take it off and exchange it for something else. So then once you've gotten that first ribbon stitched down, you can anchor off your thread. And trim it. And we'll do it all over again on the other side. All right, now we have finished hat number 2. For our third hat, I have decided to use some silk fabric that will coordinate with a couple of my outfits, and it's going to be a little more involved than the previous 2 hats that we did. But you can still use the same techniques with ribbon if you don't want to have to prep and use the silk. I've already pre-torn several pieces of silk fabric to 3 inches. The amount of fabric you're going to need for your hat is going to depend on how full you want all of the little poofs that go around the crown and how full you want the brim edging as well. For the poofs around the crown, you're going to want to go ahead and hem your silk, and it's up to you if you want to do a fancy rolled hem or if you want to do a simple quick down and dirty style hem. You can see how to do a rolled hem in our videos on YouTube. One of the handy things about doing the hemmed fabric is that since they are in strips that are a specific length, whatever the width of your fabric is, because of the type of poofs that we are doing on this hat, you don't have to sew the ends together. You can just anchor those ends and start the next one going around the hat and not have to worry about sewing them together. So I'm going to be a little bit lazy and do some longer running stitches to hem my fabric because they're really not going to be very obvious. It will go a little more quickly than doing a really nicely stitched hem. Once you have your strips of fabric hemmed, then we're going to go ahead and decorate around the crown of the hat again. On our previous hat, we did just a few kind of low, small poofs. This one we're going to do a lot more poofs, and they're going to be bigger. You can do a whole lot of poofs just right around the crown. You can do kind of a staggered double layer of poofs. You can even cover the entire crown of your hat with poofs. I'm going to do a round of larger poofs that are spaced closer together than what was on the previous hat. I have several strips of fabric that I have pre-hemmed, so I'm going to just start at a random point on my hat. I've kind of figured out about how big and how far apart I want my my poofs to be. And again, I'm not measuring with a ruler or anything. I am just going to use my fingers and my eyes and do it that way. Since I have multiple strips of hemmed fabric, I am not going to sew them end to end because it's really not necessary. I can just start and end each strip by attaching it to the crown itself, and that way I don't have to do too much extra sewing. Going to run a gathering stitch along the first end of my hemmed taffeta fabric ribbon. Like I did with the more spread out poofs, I'm going to go ahead and anchor that thread so if something does break, it's less inclined to come apart. And then I'm going to run it through the hat. And back out and catch that ribbon again to the back side of the hat again, or the inside. And then, since I am doing rather closely spaced poofs, I am going to just run the thread along the inside of the crown instead of clipping it off every single time, because it's just going to be a short float. So to measure the spacing between the poofs, I'm going to put my finger right here against where the thread came to the inside of the hat crown, and then I'm going to bring it back out on the other side of my finger, hopefully not catching my finger in the process because that hurts. You can, of course, measure everything and mark where you want your poofs to attach, and then mark your ribbon as to how far apart each of those poofs will be. I don't feel a need to do that, and it's very 18th century not to do that. So to measure the size of my poofs on the ribbon, what I'm going to do is just lay my hand on it. So the pinky side of my hand is where the previous poof anchors, and then at the thumb side of my hand is where I want to start gathering to make this first poof complete. So I just take the thread that's coming out of the hat crown, run a gathering stitch, and I'll pull that up snug so that it gathers the ribbon down. Put the needle through the crown, and then I'll take another stitch through the crown and the ribbon, just to give it a little extra anchor there. And then I'll measure to where my next poof is going to start. So I'll put my finger where the thread comes to the inside of the crown again. Run the thread back through to the outside. And I'll continue doing this all the way around the hat. So we've gotten almost all the way around. We have room for pretty much one more, maybe two if we smash them together, poofs here. But instead of making some more of the same size poofs, what I want to do is make several larger poofs so that they act as a bow on this point. So I've already brought my thread through to the outside of the hat, and I'm going to measure, instead of the breadth or the width of my hand, I'm going to measure more the length from the heel of my hand, where the ribbon attaches to the hat, to the end of my index finger. And then I will gather that spot. And I'm not trying to be super precise with any of my gathering stitches. So if you feel that your gathering stitches are kind of random and ugly, doesn't matter because you can't see them. So I'm going to anchor this one down, just like I did with the poofs that are going all the way around the crown. For the next one, instead of measuring over a finger's width, I'm just going to go back through the crown really close to where that thread is already coming out. Measure the length of my poof or loop. Gather that one up. With this one, I'm going to go back out to the front of the hat, just a little bit lower on the crown than what the previous one was. Measure the length of my loop. Run my gathering stitch. This is where it does start to get a little fiddly when you get a whole bunch of loops all together with their bases all in one spot. So just take your time. And pay attention to what you're doing so that you don't end up stitching something you don't want stitched. Going to do another loop up just a little bit higher on the crown. And then my last one, I think that'll be my last one. Yes. I'm going to bring in really low. Oops. If I can get it to go through. There we go. And since I want to make sure that my little fuzzies from the selvage don't end up sticking out, I'm going to just tuck that under, finger press it. Run my gathering stitch through there. Run it back through the hat. That loop's not making me real happy. So what I'm going to do is bring my thread back to the right side of the hat. It's a little bigger than I really wanted it. Actually, it's a lot bigger than I really wanted it. So I'm going to find somewhere in the range of the halfway point. Run the gathering stitch and anchor it back down to the crown of the hat. And just tame him a little bit. There we go. And then I will anchor off my thread. And there we have our crown embellishment. Now you can go through and fluff up your little poofs if you want. You can actually, depending how they're made, if it's not going to show and you want to keep them really full, you can take some cotton balls, work really well. You can take some polyfill and tuck that inside your little poof. Or if you've got some wool roving, you can also use that. And just tuck that in there. It makes nice full poofs. I personally like my poofs a little more free, so I'm not going to stuff these. So for the next step, we're going to bind the edge of this hat again, like we did with our second hat, except we're using a wider ribbon, or in this case, piece of fabric. So I'm going to put my back right about here. For the trim on the brim, the outside edge of the hat, I have taken a piece of a full width of my silk taffeta fabric, and I have folded under and pressed about 1/4 of an inch on either of the long sides. I'm not going to stitch this. I'm not going to hem it or baste it. Sorry, Christina. I'm not going to baste it. I'm just going to lay this onto the hat, and then when it gets stitched down, it'll be finished, so I don't have to worry about it. So I'm going to put this on so that I've got about 1/4 to 3/8 on the underside of the brim. And I'm going to clip that. I'm going to run that all the way around the hat, trying to get it as smooth as possible on the underside. The upper side is going to be a little more interesting. It'll give us some texture and all when we do it. So as we come to the end, or the beginning, of our brim trim, I'm going to go ahead and cut that off, leaving about an inch or so overlap, just so that we have it. But I do want to trim this excess piece off just so I don't have to wrestle with it while I'm doing the rest of the hat. So I'm going to start stitching the underside of the trim onto the edge of the brim, like we did it with hat 2. Trying to keep it fairly consistent about how much is wrapped to the underside of the brim. So I've stitched most of the way around the underside of my trim on the brim of the hat. I'm just going to take my last couple of stitches here, and then I will anchor off my thread. You notice that I have left my clips on the hat holding the trim down. That way it doesn't slide towards the front or towards the back. Sometimes it wants to slide to the underside, and then you end up with a whole lot of extra fabric where you don't want it. So I did leave the clips on or replaced them as I sewed past them, which is good to keep it where it needs to be until we get the front figured out, or the top of the hat. I'm gonna anchor my thread. And trim that off. So I want to figure out where I want the fold on my overlap to be. So that should give us just about the right amount. I will go ahead and give that a little finger press. So I've got a nice line. And then I can trim off the excess. So I have about a 1/4 inch of fold over or seam allowance to deal with. And then once I wrestle it into place, you notice that I left that little bit at the beginning of the overlap unstitched. So what I'm going to do is put that overlap where it belongs, clip it down, this is always the hardest part for me. Till I get it right to where my pieces overlap. There we go. And I will go ahead and start to anchor the two pieces together to make that little join. Just like we did on the previous hat with the ribbon. So we've got the underside joined. Now we're going to flip the hat over. And I'm going to run that seam up to the edge of my trim. And this is another one of those things where if you don't want to mash down the decoration that you've already done too much, you can, instead of doing that part first, you can bind the outside edge of the hat first and then go in and do your trim. It's just kind of a personal preference type of thing. So now we've got all of this excess fabric that lays on top of the brim. And this is where the fun part comes in. So you see we have left a seam allowance turned under. What you want to do is take a nice long thread and we're going to run a gathering stitch through both of those layers of your fabric. Somewhat close to the edge, and you want to try to make this stitch fairly even. You don't have to do it real tiny if you don't want to. We're going to use this rather as an actual gathering stitch. It's considered more of an easing stitch so that we can ease that fabric down to the size that we need it. So you just want to run this around. Smaller stitches will give you a tighter eased edge, I guess you would say. It won't look as much like little pleats or something if you do a smaller gathering stitch. So as you come back to your starting point with your gathers, it's a good idea to actually take one stitch past where you started your gathering, trying not to split that thread as you do it. That way, when you pull up your gathering stitches, you are less likely to leave a weird little gap between the beginning stitch and the ending stitch. So once you've gotten all of your gathering stitches done, you want to just pull those threads up. You don't want to pull them too tight because you don't want to curl your brim up, but you want them just snug enough that they're going to lay nicely all around your hat. And then go ahead and tie those two ends together to keep things from running away while you're working with pinning and stitching the top side of the trim to your hat. So now, if you want to, you can go ahead and take those edging pins or clips off because it's not going to go anywhere now. Just keep shoving things around until it looks the way you want it to look. Anchor them. If you find that some of your previous decoration is kind of being in your way, you can always just take a pin or a clip and pop it up out of your way. And then let it back down later. Sometimes I will do the same type of thing if I decide that I want to put my ties in before I put my hat trim on. Sometimes it's just a little bit easier to, depending where I'm stitching the ties, it may be easier to put those in before I put on the trim. But you can do it in whatever order is comfortable for you. There is no hard and fast rule how this needs to be done. So now you can stitch the top of your trim down just like we did on the bottom side of the hat, only this time you just want to try to catch the bottom point of each of these little gathers. Of course, you can adjust them however you need to, whoops, as you're stitching. I find at this point it's usually a little easier to go down through the point of the fabric where you want it to attach to the straw, and then run your needle and thread through the straw to the next point where you want to. So after you finish stitching the top of your brim edging, you can go ahead and clip that gathering thread and pull it out. And there you have your beautifully decorated hat. The last thing that we need to do for this hat is to put some ribbon ties on it. So I have a piece of my silk that I have hemmed. This time I used just one width of the silk, hemmed both sides, and then also hemmed the ends. And I'm going to run it across the inside of the crown. So I've found approximately the center mark. It's going to sit at the center of the hat. I'm gonna give it a little pin here, just to kind of, maybe I'm gonna give it a little pin here. Pins and straw are not always happy. Like right now. There we go. I'm gonna take my thread that actually is straw colored, and I'm just gonna run a real easy, quick stitch right through the top of the hat, the top of the crown of the hat, making sure that I don't catch my trim while I'm doing this. So then as you finish up the second side, because you do want to run a stitch on both sides of the crown, just to keep the hat from trying to spin on your head, which is what would happen if you only stitched it in the middle or on one of the sides. Anchor the thread. And now you can floof it back up a little bit if you've squashed your poofs. And we have a very nice hat ready to be worn and to look very fashionable and protect us from the sun. Thanks for joining us for our mini sew along with the straw hats. We hope that you have enjoyed sewing along with us and that you have created something fantastic to wear with your costumes. Grew is very pleased with the hat that he has made. So he wants to remind you that if you like these videos, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe, and be sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook and tag us with your makes. Until next time, hats off to you and happy sewing.